Off. Hi, all of you who have joined us, and hopefully some more will come as we get started. I am especially pleased today to introduce a very, very close friend of mine, and one of the reasons that I was most sad to leave Michigan when I came here 2.5 years ago. Although somebody I probably should have never liked in the first place, we attended graduate school about 10 miles away from each other at universities that are sworn enemies. He at Duke and me at the University of North Carolina. We both graduated in the same year. And he was in political science. I was in geography, but this is about him. So focusing on the political science, then went to do a postdoc with Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics for work that surely Arun was contributing to while he was at Indiana, but then also picked up some of the stream of work with the IFRI program, which is a program of monitoring forest and communities, working together, community forestry. Over time, he moved that to Michigan some years ago when he moved to Michigan in 2001, I think.
2003.
2003, okay. And he's been at Michigan since 2003, is the Samuel Dana Professor. Is that right?
You got it.
Okay. And 2 years ago was elected to the National Academy of Sciences for his excellent work. He's got 2 books, there's probably more than that, but Environmentality and Greener Pastures. The Greener Pastures book, I think, was based on your dissertation work or something that came after that. And then Environmentality has received a lot of attention. And I've been pleased to work with Arun on a number of projects in Mongolian grasslands and most recently on land transactions, environmental and social impacts in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And he's going to talk about something else today related to transfer payments and the impacts that they may have, or not, I guess, is the question, on resilience in smallholder systems, I think. But I'll let you tell us more about that, Arun. And thank you for taking the time to join us here at the University of Washington. Welcome.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for inviting me to do this talk. You had asked me to come and talk earlier, and I'm sorry that I couldn't come last year. Excuse me. And but Zoom makes many things simpler, even as it makes the results of interactions less satisfying. Nonetheless, I am very pleased to be here and to be talking with you about some work I have started recently, just about 2 or 3 years ago. I should say that when Dan asked me to do a talk, we had a very short discussion on what I could talk about, and this was one topic. There's another bit of work we started recently in Indonesia on climate adaptation, particularly how climate adaptation can effectively be a response and be supported by external actors by a fine-grained assessment of vulnerability in different parts of a given region. And the work we did in Indonesia, I'm very excited about that. We are proposing the idea of vulnerability profiles in contrast to much of the work on climate adaptation that is based on indexing vulnerability or estimating levels of vulnerability, and we want to come up with an alternative argument on that. But that work was just a little bit less mature than this one. although I can't say that this one is very, very mature either. So be gentle with the questions. And if you have tough questions, I will ask Dan to answer them. So without further ado, let me share my screen with you and give you a sense of what this presentation is about. I will be talking, so, no, that's not the thing I want. Share screen, yes, that's what I want. So can you see my screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So this work is, I started this work about 3 years ago in partnership with the International Institute for Environment and Development in London. And we did some field work in India as part of that process. But what I'm going to talk with you about today are mostly the global scale survey, review, and analysis we have been doing, and trying to work through some of the uh, mechanisms through which social assistance programs can support climate resilience or climate adaptation in the communities and for the households that receive social assistance or that receive social assistance benefits. The presentation I will talk first about what is social assistance and what are the different forms in which it exists. Dan said to me that the school has relatively few social scientists, so hopefully this description will be not too much repetition of what you already know. Then I'll talk a little bit about why should we be thinking about climate resilience in the context of social assistance, and then go into what's the scale and impacts of social assistance, and then just do a very quick study, very quick review of two main social assistance programs, cash transfers and employment guarantees. And I should say social assistance takes many forms in uh, different countries, and in poor countries, lower and middle income countries, cash transfers of different kinds and employment guarantees are the most widespread programs of social assistance. And then conclude with a few observations about what next. So what is social assistance? It's a rights or outcome-oriented effort to transfer resources to poor and vulnerable. And the goals of social assistance are to improve well-being, to reduce vulnerability, and to enhance opportunities and social status for recipients of social assistance. So in these different ways, social assistance has a number of areas of overlap with the goals of climate resilience or climate adaptation efforts. In particular, if you look at the goals of social assistance, they are almost a one-to-one match with what climate adaptation efforts seek to accomplish. And so this is why this is what makes investigating and looking into how social assistance works and with what effects a particularly rewarding avenue of investigation when we think about climate adaptation and climate resilience. There are three major types of social assistance. The first is and I'm not talking about customary means of social assistance, which are typically based within the family or in networks or in a given community. They have historically been very important, but they are declining in importance and in relevance and in ubiquity around the world. So they continue to exist, and in many cases, they are absolutely crucial to those who need assistance, but they're declining in importance. The ones that I'll focus on the most are transfers, and these are non-contributory transfers. If you think of Social Security in the United States, that's a form of social assistance, but it is a contributory social assistance. People pay money into their account, and then upon reaching a certain age, they're eligible to withdraw money from that account. And it's not, the relationship is not exact between how much you put in and how much you take out, but it's a contributory social assistance. In contrast, in much of the lower and middle income world, the social assistance programs that exist and which I'll be talking about are non-contributory. They're cash They can be cash assistance programs, they can be in-kind assistance, they can be based in public works, they can be food transfers, they can be waivers of different kinds of fees for health, for transport, can be subsidies for education. All of these are non-contributory transfers to those who need such benefits. The second form of social assistance is social protection or social assistance is called social insurance. And this is essentially also a contributory program, and its pensions and health programs are the prime examples of it. And the third form of social assistance, or third major form of social assistance, is unemployment benefits, reskilling, and job guarantees. So all of these forms exist in the world. They are a major mechanism to support people who need such support. And there has been very, very little work that examines how social assistance has environmental outcomes. To what extent does social assistance also contribute to both environmental outcomes in the ecological or in the environmental sense, but also in social ecological systems, but very little work on how it also supports climate adaptation or climate resilience. So I already said that one major link between social protection and climate resilience is the overlap in their goals. And when one focuses on poor and middle income countries, what one is also struck by is the sheer scope and breadth of social assistance programs, particularly in comparison to climate adaptation, climate resilience efforts. If you really scrape the barrel and try to add up every single way in which climate adaptation is supported by governments or by international donors and bilateral funding agencies, maybe you'll come up with a figure of maybe 3, 5, $10 billion. I think in its wildest dreams, the IPCC hopes and the Paris Climate Agreements hope that governments might put something like $100 billion towards climate adaptation in poor countries. We are nowhere close to meeting those kind of numbers. Maybe last year, the total climate adaptation support available was about $20 billion. In contrast, social assistance programs in lower and middle income countries add up to more than $600 billion annually. And so you just have a substantially larger scope of these programs, which makes it really important to understand to what extent they may already be supporting climate adaptation and climate resilience, and how and to what extent one might in fact strengthen or enhance that result of social assistance without undermining or without making some of the social goals of these transfer programs come out worse. In addition to the scope and breadth of these programs, and in contrast to work on climate adaptation that governments and donors are doing, there already exists a very substantial infrastructure for the implementation of social assistance. So even if governments somehow began putting aside $100 billion for supporting climate adaptation, implementing it will take an enormous effort. And if one were to, or if governments or decision makers were to try to create a new bureaucracy for implementing these programs, it would require additional effort. And in contrast, we have a ready-made, and many people would agree that it is not good enough, but it is nonetheless vastly superior to what we have in place for supporting climate adaptation and climate resilience. And then the third reason that social protection and climate resilience really, it is important to explore those linkages is because we know that if we leave, if we leave climate, if climate threats continue apace, if the risks of climate change continue to escalate as they have been, much of the gains that we have secured in terms of development outcomes, in terms of improvements in people's well-being and in incomes, will be wiped out. I think there's a recent report from the World Bank came out last year, which estimated that by 2030 itself, close to 100 million people will be thrust back into poverty as a result of climate change and climate risks. By 2050, more than 720 million people are expected to be pushed back into poverty, which will wipe out the entire gains of people who have come out of poverty, households that have increased their incomes over the last 3 decades. So I think it's really important to understand how social protection, how social assistance is already strengthening climate resilience, and what we can do to make that connection more to better integrate that connection, to better enhance that connection. And thus, these figures give you a little bit of a sense of the scope and breadth of coverage of social assistance. And if you're just looking at the expenditures across different regions, they add up to about $500 billion, and this is using 2011 dollars, and cover close to 35% of the population. There's a different way to look at the scope and breadth of these programs, which is what's the coverage and the amount of expenditure on these programs by different program types. And so conditional and unconditional cash transfers add up to about $200 billion. Public works programs or employment guarantees, another $35–40 billion. And then school feeding programs, pensions, in-kind transfers, another $300 or so billion. So overall, quite substantial investments by governments in these programs. And this is not just by rich countries. This is these are only figures for lower and middle income countries. So a lot of these are investments that the country governments themselves are making. They're not dependent, or they're not dependent on international aid or programs of aid by developed country or rich country governments. And this just gives you a sense of how these expenditures are distributed across the lower and middle income world. I included some of the data for rich countries on absolute spending on social protection, but when it comes to specific programs, the conditional and unconditional cash transfers and public works programs, you'll see the amounts are much smaller, and there's also substantial diversity in how these funds are spent. And there's also a difference across countries in what kind of social assistance programs they focus on, or on which they are spending the most. So if you look at a country like India, you see a lot of spending happening on public works. It spends close to about $35 billion in purchasing power parity terms on public works and employment guarantees. But when you look at the same country in terms of conditional cash transfers or unconditional cash transfers, the total amounts are much less. And you'll see a similar kind of variation in how countries have opted to support their citizens or to support their residents when it comes to per capita expenditures as well. So you see a significant level of per capita expenditure in South Africa, much smaller amounts in other countries, and which is not to say that South Africa is spending a huge amount. It's still a fairly small amount compared to rich country standards. But you see, again, there's a lot of variation in how much countries spend on social assistance and for what kinds of programs. So we did a meta-analysis of these different programs. But before I go there, would it be useful for me to describe these three different kinds of programs in a little bit more detail so people know what I'm talking about, or is that fairly obvious? Dan, what would you say?
Maybe
should I talk a little bit about different conditional and conditional cash transfers, et cetera, or leave that aside?
Sure. Concrete examples, so that we know kind of what those are.
Yeah. I'll just briefly describe those. So cash transfers are essentially programs where people just get money for being poor, or people just get money. So there are two ways in which cash transfer programs work. One is where governments or donors or NGOs essentially just transfer money to a poor family. There is no condition. They get the money just because they're poor. And even within those, there's some countries where everybody gets a fixed amount of money. Alaska's Permanent Fund is an example that comes to mind. It's not a country, it's a state. But everybody gets a certain amount of money just because they live in Alaska. The other kind is where you target the program towards the poor, or towards poor families, but they get the money without having to do anything. They get it simply to support their consumption expenditures. The second kind, so these are called unconditional cash transfers, and there's a lot of discussion about, Andrew Yang talked about cash transfers in his platform. Under COVID, the U.S. government and many other countries' governments in Europe, et cetera, have been transferring money to families. Essentially, it's just a transfer for not for any particular reason. It's just a transfer to support consumption, to support a minimal level of consumption, let's say. The second kind are called conditional cash transfers, where the transfer of any amount of money is still happening or being directed towards the poor as much as possible, but on the basis of some conditions being attached to the transfer. So either those conditions may be actions that people have to undertake. You need to go to the clinic 3 times to get yourself checked. You need to take your child to the clinic to make sure that he or she is not underweight. And once that condition is met, you get the transfer. Or you need to send your child to school every day for the month before you get your conditional cash transfers. So these are the 2 main forms of cash transfers, conditional and unconditional. And a third variant of that, universal basic income, is the one that Yang has talked about and which has been in news to some extent in the US and definitely in other countries as well. The other kind of major program that I'll talk about just briefly, public works programs, essentially date back literally more than a century, and they came into being in response to citizens experiencing temporary reductions in their consumption as a result of some natural disaster. And so, particularly in countries that were colonized by Britain, but also in some of the other countries, you see this as a major form of social assistance that independent governments in those nation states have continued, which is to provide people a number of days of guaranteed employment and to say that when you are employed, you'll be working on some infrastructure public works project that will create a public good for the community or for people living around that location. It could be road construction, it could be work on dams, it could be small agricultural infrastructure, it could be tree plantations, but all of these are essentially efforts to create some public good, but at the same time provide a guaranteed number of days of employment to those who are benefiting or those who are targeted by the employment guarantee or public works program. The largest of these in India that employs about 75 million households, provides employment to 75 million people in 75 million households, and costs about $35 billion annually. And and when we come to look at thinking about the effects of these programs, we'll see how much they have contributed to reducing poverty in the lower and middle income world. So we did a meta-analysis of 65 programs in lower and middle income countries, and we tried to see of these the public works programs in poor countries, and we tried to see to what extent they are leading to or they are supporting climate resilience outcomes. And we distinguished between 3 kinds of climate resilience outcomes: absorptive resilience, adaptive resilience, and transformational or transformative resilience. And what we found was that the social assistance interventions in the form of public works or employment guarantees are reasonably good at supporting absorptive and to some extent adaptive resilience, and they're not very good at supporting transformative resilience outcomes. So what do we mean by absorptive or adaptive or transformative resilience? Essentially, we can think of absorptive resilience as the ability of households to cope with or to absorb some shocks, some stresses that they are experiencing as a result of environmental fluctuations or volatility in environmental conditions. Adaptive resilience is an outcome that households are able to, or communities are able to adopt uh, to increase their incomes or to increase their asset holdings, and thereby not just cope with different climate stresses or different environmental stresses that they are experiencing, but also perhaps improve their living standards or improve their material well-being despite the occurrence of these climate stresses. Transformative resilience is a situation where people are essentially adopting entirely new ways of earning an income or of securing a livelihood, which is better suited to the kinds of climate stresses or environmental stresses they're experiencing. So people migrating or leaving farming uh, in, in preference to being artisans or uh, taking office paying jobs, those are essentially examples of transformative resilience. And the question is, to what extent do these social assistance programs contribute to or enable these three different ways of coping with or adapting to climate risks? So in terms of so we did two studies, one of cash transfers and one of employment guarantees, and roughly, I'll just give you the highlights from these. More than 125 countries have adopted some form of cash transfer program over the last 3 decades. And these span all the three variants I mentioned: conditional, unconditional, and universal basic income. Most of them are conditional and unconditional cash transfers. So there's been just a remarkable growth since the 1990s. The total expenditures on social assistance in the form of cash transfers were less than $20 billion in 1991. And today, as I mentioned, they're closer to $130 billion across the lower and middle income world, all in constant 2011 dollars. We also see for cash transfers that they support absorptive and adaptive resilience. There's less evidence of transformative resilience, just as we mentioned for public works programs or employment guarantees. And most of these changes are occurring through support for consumption expenditures for the very poor. So essentially, when we talk about absorptive resilience, we are seeing that these cash transfers allow the poor to cope with some levels of climate risks by being able to absorb them better without reducing their consumption. And then finally, we also found that most of the existing work on cash transfers, and there are literally hundreds of impact assessments of cash transfers, they all focus on social well-being, but there's very, very limited work on environmental and climate adaptation outcomes. And this then takes us into this direction of thinking about how is it that when existing studies do not talk about environmental outcomes, they can still make some inferences about their role in climate adaptation. And I'll come to that towards the end of my talk. The second case study that we did on employment guarantees looked at the distribution of these programs in the lower and middle income world. And many of these programs combine a number of different prongs through which they seek to address poverty and improve material well-being. I already mentioned they provide wage labor, they guarantee some number of days of employment to people. I'm focusing in this case on the Indian program since it is so large. They create rural infrastructure, and at the same time, they also try to strengthen rural institutions by involving people more closely in decision-making, by improving financial access, and by strengthening local institutions. And at the individual level, they try to provide new skills to households to enable them to move away from activities and from jobs that are more climate sensitive to, that are more to less climate sensitive. So how do we connect social protection or social assistance to climate resilience? And so essentially what we did in our study in both of these reviews, case studies, was to focus on the indicators through which researchers have measured social assistance outcomes. And these indicators focus on nutrition, on caloric intake, on consumption levels, on incomes, both productive, non-productive assets, health, sanitation, literacy, and education, and levels of migration or crime or social solidarity or cohesion at the village level. And we find that these are the same kind of indicators that scholars of resilience have used when talking about resilience outcomes. So it is because there's an overlap in the indicators used by scholars of social protection, even though they don't focus on climate or environmental outcomes, and by scholars of resilience outcomes, that we can make the connection between social protection and climate resilience. Uh, so what we find that when we look at these first set of indicators here, those are primarily linked to absorptive and adaptive resilience. And then the second set of indicators, new skills, resilient assets, climate resilient assets, infrastructure, there's less clear evidence on whether social protection is contributing to those forms of climate resilience. More importantly, there's the conceptual challenge of the extent to which we can link the effects of social assistance on resilience outcomes, absorptive, adaptive, and transformative, by investigating the mechanisms through which these resilience outcomes occur. So in the standard social and ecological science work, 6 different features of resilient systems are highlighted: modularity, redundancy, networking, diversity, networking or connectedness, diversity, learning, and so self-organization. So very, very little of the existing work, whether on cash transfers or on social or on employment guarantees, connect the transfers of these amounts or the provision of employment to how these different features, resilience features of communities and households are enhanced. We only know how it leads to the absorptive or the adaptive or the transformative outcome. So it's just a huge new area of work that is waiting for investigation, and which we are now turning into, and some of the work we did in Indonesia is looking into as well. And so finally, some of the challenges in linking social protection to climate resilience, the emerging programs in many countries. In many countries, these programs have achieved scale, but there's still patchiness in needed levels of support. So I contrasted the amounts that governments and donors are spending on climate adaptation versus social protection or social assistance. But regardless of that scale difference, the amounts needed for effectively taking care of those who are poor are still substantially greater. And some scholars have estimated, some researchers have estimated that to eliminate poverty, the basic amount, the total amount needed to eliminate the global poverty gap is about $300 billion. But you would want to add to that cost of spending that money. So it's still, I mean, $500 billion is a fairly large amount of money, but we still need perhaps another $300 to $400 billion to meet the basic social assistance needs by the poor in lower and middle income. We have a significant amount of conceptual gap in how to connect social assistance and cash transfers or employment guarantees to the resilience outcomes by paying more systematic attention, by linking them more systematically to the resilience features of social and social ecological systems. In practical terms, there's very limited coordination across implementation actors and agencies working on social assistance programs in poor countries. And this coordination is not only very little, it's almost non-existent when it comes to activities related to social assistance and activities related to climate resilience, in part because they're in different ministries and different bureaucratic structures, and there's very little conversation across these structures. So some of the ways in which one could think about strengthening effectiveness is one, to ensure continued growth of support for social assistance. As we know, social programs are hard to cut once they come into being, and that's true as much for rich as for poor countries. And we see the evidence for that in the growth of these programs from something like 20 or $30 billion in early 1990s to more than 20 times the size, 30 times the size in 2020. These programs are like census operations, or like a lot of other government activities are less attentive, are less able to incorporate those who are migrants or those who don't have a fixed location. And so one way to enhance their effectiveness would be to make them portable and to have a better way of connecting citizens to these programs. Um, we know from existing assessments of conditional versus unconditional cash transfers that where you impose conditions on the transferred amounts, transferred support, you see better outcomes, you see better performance along those outcome indicators. So if the assistance is conditional on people sending their children to school, we see improvements in literacy, we see improvements in school achievement. Similarly, for health outcomes. And so one argument to strengthen climate resilience would be to incorporate conditions around adaptation or around resilience into the distribution of the cash transfers or timing of employment, days of employment. We need much better research, I already said, on linking climate and ecosystem outcomes of social protection to the resilience features and to understand and assess those relationships. And finally, we need to strengthen coordination across the different implementation actors, different ministries and sectors for strengthening the effectiveness of social assistance for improved climate adaptation outcomes. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. This is a really interesting example of ways that we might think about social programs, social development actions and programs as playing a role in outcomes that are both social and environmental within the context of social, ecological, social environmental systems. I was curious, the social assistance programs that you're talking about, I presume aren't motivated necessarily by climate mitigation or environmental programs at all. They're motivated by development and the well-being of the population. But I'm not even clear that they're motivated by climate resilience per se. Or you're just asking the question, when those exist, is climate resilience improved? Is that
yes,
right?
That is exactly right. I think you are absolutely right that the social protection or social assistance programs that I described and which I talked about, the motivation for these is the expectation that such programs will improve material well-being of those who receive benefits. In fact, the origins of social protection or social assistance are, at least in terms of people's recognition of the effects of these programs, they significantly predate even a broad awareness of climate risks and climate change in official and government agencies. So yes, that is true. But I think in terms of understanding their effects, I think the evidence that we have at this point is almost incontrovertible that they are having climate adaptation, positive climate adaptation and climate resilience outcomes. And I think that just re-emphasizes the importance of understanding the relationship between social and economic interventions and their ecological and social outcomes. So even as we have literally hundreds of economists who look at how these programs are improving consumption and income and so on and so forth, there is almost no work in economics that looks at how they might be improving climate adaptation or climate resilience of either households or of ecosystems or of settlements and communities. And I think that's where there is tremendous scope for those of us who work on social ecological systems to really push on that agenda, to think about how, whether it is an environmental program like protected, environmental intervention, let's say, or natural resource intervention like protected areas or community-based conservation, the effects of that are not just in the in the environmental arena, not just in the ecological dimension. The effects of that are also in the social and economic dimension. And the opposite is also absolutely true, that when you're pushing ahead with different kinds of economic interventions, and we talked about social assistance, but you can pick really any economic intervention, industrialization and agricultural development and green revolution. They all have also they all also have ecological and environmental effects. And I think to some extent we examine these questions, but the attention we pay to the simultaneous social and economic outcomes, social economic outcomes on the one hand, and of environmental ecological outcomes on the other hand, of an intervention that is nominally classified as being social or environmental. We just don't pay systematic attention to outcomes in both domains, or more than one domain, I guess I should say.
That's one of the great things about your work. We're starting to get some additional questions here. I guess I would just say, in your analysis, did you look at the sort of environmental, so your assessments of absorptive and adaptive and transformative, did you look at the environmental sort of feedbacks within the ways in which people were?
I'm sorry that I couldn't, that's why I'm sorry that I did not or could not present the Indonesia work to you, which is looking exactly at this question. So in Indonesia, there's, the data, so I always talk about how data rich in work on India is. And of course, people in the US laugh because there's so much more data in the US for really anything you want to study. But Indonesia has this amazing data set, which is at the village level for all 76,000 Indonesian villages. And there are waves of data every 3 years. So starting in 2000, we have data for 2000, 2003. So using that data, you can look at how social assistance programs have varied between different countries, or different villages, both in terms of their timing and in terms of the amount. And we have data for Indonesia on the changes in land cover over the last 20 years or 25 years or so. So JT and I have been doing that work on looking at how social assistance interventions simultaneously affect things like levels of conflict, levels of criminality, levels of levels of forest cover, changes in croppings, changes in new crop adoption, and obviously all this data is observational, so it's not an experimental design, but we see some things very systematically across the years when we look at variations in levels of expenditures by the government on social programs. Places where you have higher levels of social expenditures per capita, you see lower deforestation in those villages. So that's a preliminary finding. It's you're still doing a whole bunch of different robustness checks, but I feel like that's the kind of work we need to do because nobody else is doing it, and that's like the most interesting kind of work when it comes to thinking about sustainability or thinking about social ecological systems.
So I'm going to ask some of the people who are posting questions here. Vedavati Patwardhan, I'm going to just enable your mic if you want to ask your questions. You have a couple here.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, Arun. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I am a PhD candidate at the Evans School working with Professor Lee Anderson. So I had two questions. One of them was related to what you think relevant conditionalities would be for these programs, given that they might not be designed specifically to affect the resilience outcomes. And then I guess my second question is, to what extent would you say that resilience effects might differ by type of social protection? So employment guarantee program like NREX in India versus cash transfers.
So there is relatively little work that let me answer your second question first. And then if I forget the first one, I'll ask you again. So there's relatively little work on how employment guarantee programs differ from cash transfers in terms of their impacts. And as you can imagine, it's difficult to undertake that kind of analysis in a reliable way for a whole bunch of different reasons that we haven't really randomized the allocation of benefits under employment guarantee versus cash transfers versus a controlled set of households, right? So most of the work that we have is looking either only at cash transfers or only at employment guarantee programs. And then because the programs are so different in their modality, it's also hard to reliably attribute outcomes only to those programs when you're looking at observational data. But people have looked at the effectiveness of cash transfers in the conditional versus the unconditional variant. And what we can say is that where you have conditions, you see improved performance, improved outcomes in the condition dimension. So where you have a cash transfer that is linked to performance or outcomes in educational achievement, you see improvements in families that receive the cash transfer versus those that don't, and families receive a general transfer versus those that don't. Or what the existing evidence does not allow us to say is if that improved performance in the dimension of the condition also translates into an improved general well-being outcome for those receiving cash conditional versus unconditional cash transfers, okay? So we can say that the condition itself improves performance in the dimension of the condition, but we can't say whether it improves general well-being or well-being more broadly when you get a conditional versus an unconditional cash transfer. And of course, as I feared, I have forgotten your first question. So can you please repeat that?
Yeah, of course. My first question was about what you think the conditionality.
The type of conditions that can be attached to these programs. Yeah, so I think, but some of the part of the answer is perhaps evident from the description that I provided of the employment guarantee program in India, where you already have some mechanism for providing new skills, for reskilling people as a part of the architecture of the employment guarantee program. So what you could say, for example, is, and there's, so this particular program provides 100 days of guaranteed employment to any able-bodied person in Indian villages, okay? So what you could say is that if you go to a reskilling program, you will be guaranteed another 10 or 20 or 25 days of employment for an additional income to your household. Or what they could say is that where you have the threat of rain failure or of a drought, we will link the provision of number of days of employment to the occurrence or the realization of that threat. So there are a number of different ways in which you can strengthen the effectiveness of these existing programs in addressing climate vulnerability by linking them to climate-specific outcomes or climate-specific outcomes or events, right? So I would say, given the experience we have from the conditional versus unconditional program evaluations, that would be a fruitful way to think about enhancing existing social protection efforts at a relatively low additional cost for a substantial well-being and climate resilience gain.
Okay, Mary Fisher had a question about, if you want to ask it, or I can read the question. I've just given you permission to ask if you want to ask it. She says,
"Thank you." Don't let Dan speak for you.
That's right. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my Wi-Fi. So if I stop in the middle of the question, I apologize, and maybe Dan can just pick up wherever I leave off. Thank you for such a good presentation. It's really interesting. I'm a PhD student in SEFS, and I was just thinking back to your conceptual challenges slide that you had up, and wondering if, because of those household and community scale factors that affect adaptive and transformative capacity, is it safe to assume that the same program could lead to different resilience outcomes in different communities? And then I was wondering if you saw any evidence of this when you were doing the meta-analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have your finger on the exact issue that makes inference, causal inference, difficult in observational outcomes, in observational studies. So we looked at. So I was telling you that we carried out some study in India where we collected data on in 4 different states on about 800 households, looking at one, what was the level of payment they received, which is linked obviously to the number of number of days of employment they had through this employment guarantee program. So what was the payment they received, and then what was the change in their income between as a over the year, and in different climatic threat context. So we collected data in Orissa and Jharkhand, Sikkim, and Maharashtra, and we see very clear differences in the effectiveness of these programs in helping people cope with or adapt to the different climate threats they face. And the variation in these outcomes is absolutely linked in part to the existing level of household well-being, their social capital, and their connectedness to other households and to government agencies, to the occupational profile that they have, or the income portfolios that they have. So there is clearly a whole lot going on, right? And when you have a relatively small data set, as we did, it's much harder to make a reliable generalization that you can then also control for different environmental, social, contextual conditions. But what we could say is that people who, on average, people who received social, who were participating in the employment guarantee program versus those who were participating more than 50 days of employment in the employment guarantee program versus less than 50 days, controlling for their prior levels of income and assets, those who received higher levels of transfers did better in terms of improving their ability to recover their incomes after experiencing the climate threat, right? So, it's hard then to say by how much did these different contextual conditions affect their ability to recover their incomes. I think we would probably need a much larger amount of data than we collected, and probably a better design study as well. But just in terms of some very basic headline level findings from that study, we find that those who receive higher versus lower days of employment support tend to do better in terms of recovering their income after experiencing a climatic threat.
We have 2 questions that are kind of related, and then I'll turn it over to Sergey, who's got a question. But the related questions are, was social assistance addressed at all in the Paris Climate Agreement? And relatedly, are the countries that most contribute to climate change supporting social assistance in low and middle income countries?
Yeah. Good question. I think two good questions. So social assistance was not a big target of discussions in the Paris Climate Agreements. Social assistance is a big focus in the development of the SDGs. And there's, I think, the SDG 1, which is about no poverty or eliminating poverty by 2030, that sees a substantial role for social assistance programs, and under target 1.4 or something like that. I'll have to look again to be sure about that. But social assistance, and this just goes back to the point that Dan was making earlier, that we tend to think about these programs and these interventions in very sort of narrow terms. Right? If it's a social assistance program, obviously it's about poverty. How can it be about climate change? How can it be about, land cover? When the reality is that, in fact, it is about climate change. It is about land cover. The relationships may be more indirect, yes, than a program that directly focuses on enhancing climate adaptive capacity. But given the scale and ubiquity of these programs, the overall effects are clearly much, much, much larger than any climate adaptation program that we have in place, right? So to ignore this and to say that you care about climate adaptation is to ignore one of the largest sources of positive outcomes around adaptation that we already have, right? So, so the first question was about to what extent is this addressed in the Paris Climate Agreements? And then, sorry, tell me the second. Okay, I'm getting old. You just have to ask me one question at a time. Okay.
Well, so you talked about the low and middle income countries contributing to their own social assistance. To what degree are the wealthy countries, the emitter countries, contributing? Yeah.
Yes. So I should say that wealthy countries are contributing to social assistance programs, particularly in the poorest of countries that don't have sufficient fiscal capacity to meet the obligations of these programs on their own. The amounts being transferred are relatively small, but in countries like Eritrea, Somalia, Mali, Malawi, and even some of the Latin American / Caribbean countries, rich countries are contributing through their bilateral aid agencies to supporting social assistance programs in these countries. Now, is this aid in proportion to the climate harm they have caused? Is this reliable, or is this a commitment for the long run? All of those are open questions, right? And one could make an argument that in fact they should be open questions, but that's where we are. We do see support from countries, in particular Scandinavian countries, but also from the UK, from Germany, for support for social assistance programs in poor countries, in really poor countries. Yeah. But this is social assistance should be the responsibility of country governments, not of bilateral donors or of aid agencies. I believe that we have so much money in this world. We have so much damn money in this world. Why should the amount of money we need to, as I said, to just eliminate poverty is so small compared to the amount of money that the world generates every year. Like the 50 top billionaires increased their net worth by $300 billion in the last 6 months in the context of a pandemic. Like, what justifies that? Okay, I'm betraying my left-leaning. I'm going to stop there right now.
All right, I'm going to give the last question to the economist, Sergey.
Right. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Arun, for a great talk. I was just wondering if, in your experience and in your detailed overview of these programs, do you see some prominent examples, or do you see any kind of trend in tying these assistance programs to essentially, we might say something like payment for ecosystem services approaches, or at least providing employment and assistance that isn't at odds with environmental goals and more broadly, let's say, mitigation and adaptation goals?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I see a trend towards increased support for environmental outcomes and social assistance in the design of social assistance programs. But I will say that we did a study where we looked specifically at what are the activities under the employment guarantee scheme in India, and program in India, just in part because it's so large. And we found that over the last decade, and we know this because the government actually publishes this data. So over the last 10 years or so, roughly about 16% of the expenditures under the Employment Guarantee Program were for creation of what we call natural infrastructure. So natural infrastructure included rehabilitation of croplands, it improved drainage in agricultural fields, construction of different kinds of check dams, planting of trees, incorporation of native species in efforts by farmers to put trees on their farms. So there is clearly some attention to this in the government, because that's not the automatic kind of investment that comes to mind when you think about public infrastructure. In India, especially, most of the ideas about what is public infrastructure, what is the appropriate public works intervention, just like roads, build a road. And that just goes back to the famine time, like put people to work breaking stones and for making roads. So clearly there's been some evolution in the thinking among government officials and among decision makers as to what kind of things could be broadly viewed as public works and as appropriate infrastructure in rural context. I don't know that I can say that about cash transfer programs, because the mechanism, the modality in cash transfers is so simple at one level, right? It's just like give money to people who need it. That's all you do. It's like give them money. Don't ask for anything. Don't expect them to do any work in return. Just give them money. And if you ask, or if you put conditions, those conditions are also for their own private benefit, right? To get better healthcare, to send their kids to school. So in those cases, in the case of cash transfers, I'm hard put to come up with an example of a program that consciously incorporates environmental conditions in its design and implementation. The most famous of the Oportunidades program, we just don't see that kind of attention to environmental outcomes. I think in the employment guarantee and public works programs, we see a lot more of that. We see that in Ethiopia, we see that in Malawi, we see that in Mexico, we see that in Pakistan, we see that in Bangladesh, we see that in Nepal. So a lot more of that, because the instrument is more flexible, it's more capable of accommodating additional objectives compared to a cash transfer program, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
And with that, I will thank you as well, and thank you again for extending your workday in Michigan to 7:30 to join us here for our regular Wednesday afternoon seminar. And I look forward to seeing you in person again.
Dan, it was a pleasure. I'm very happy to have talked about this with your colleagues and with your students. And if you have any questions, especially, I don't work on resilience in any conceptual way. So if you have any suggestions or advice for me, I would be very happy to receive it. And I just want to thank you again for inviting me. And it will cost you for making me extend my workday beyond 5 o'clock. You know that.
We'll pay overtime.
Okay, thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you for you.
Take care.
Thank you very much, Molly. Bye.
Bye.